Okay, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to do a really kind of quick lecture as an introduction to what we're going to look at this week, which is historically the treatment of the mentally ill throughout history. Mental illness and psychological disorders and stress and breakdown are things we're going to look at as units throughout the course. But since the first unit was like foundations of psychology, we've been looking at some important psychological theory that lays the foundation for other theories in all the other units. And we looked at a history of psychology itself and how it developed as a discipline of study. This is kind of the last thing we're going to look at for the first unit, which is our views and our treatment of the mentally ill throughout history as kind of like a historical overview. You'll see in your lesson today that there's this attached handout. That's what we're going to be going through. I'm going to read parts of it to you, show you some images, add some content in to provide you with a solid background for what you're going to be looking at in tomorrow's class and the following class. So your handout here, it says the treatment of the mentally ill, a historical overview. It says thousands of years ago, our ancestors attributed earthquakes, lightning, thunder, to evil spirits, to gods and goddesses, to demons, to witchcraft. There was a lot of supernatural explanations for natural occurrences in the world. Similarly, a person with bizarre behavior that didn't fit the norm of the time, were often viewed to be possessed, to be evil, witches, demons, cursed. So just like we explained things in our natural world that were unsettling to us, a lot of people explained what they would consider bizarre or abnormal in context of the norms of the time to supernatural things as well. And this is true of human behavior. So there was a lot of different things that were done to the mentally ill throughout history. Some of them were inhumane and brutal, exorcisms, non-medical treatments that were based on magic. So there was always this kind of idea that people that didn't fit the norm or that would have abnormal behavior, that there was something wrong with them, that they were evil, that they didn't belong in our society. And we see this view dominant throughout many, many years of history, throughout thousands of years of history, to be afraid of things that aren't like ourselves. And we even see this attitude sometimes in current stigma towards mental illness. A little bit of fear, a little bit of judgment of things that are different or unknown. We're going to look at the root of that, where this comes from historically. You can see on your sheet it says about 5,000 years ago, Egyptian priests thought that afflicted individuals needed to sleep in temples. They hoped their dreams would reveal something for their treatment. Centuries later, we talked about, in other lessons, what the Greeks believed in terms of what caused psychology and how they studied it. We talked about the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, all their views on the brain and what psychology was and what caused human behavior. The Greeks obviously were trying to find cures for their patients as well. We know the Greeks were the first to question the role of gods in creating abnormal human behavior. For a long time, if you had any kind of disability or sickness, whether it was physical or mental, people assumed in this time period it was punishment from the gods or you were cursed, and then there had to be some kind of supernatural cure. The Greeks were the first to question this idea and to instead say that just like physical illness has natural causes, maybe mental illnesses do as well. So the Greeks were much more humane in their treatment of mental illness. They looked at ideas like exercise and sleep and what the person was eating as ways to make their mental health better, which we know are so important now. So the Greeks were on the right path. They would give them, baths. They would talk to them, which was helpful. We know that, if you remember from our last sheet, once we hit the Middle Ages, the world becomes very much influenced by religious fear and paranoia again. And a lot of the science that was introduced during the Greeks and the Romans, it disappears. So this time period was not good for the treatment of the mentally ill. It was very inhumane, it was very brutal, it was very fueled by fear and superstition. So you see on your sheet here, this is the beginning of what comes to your mind when you think of insane asylums. And the word asylum itself, right? The word asylum itself is a place of refuge. If you're seeking asylum, you're seeking rest from something. protection from something. That's not what these asylums were in this time period. They were places of inhumane treatment and torture of the mentally ill who were seen as freaks and people who needed to be isolated from their communities and shunned and put somewhere. So a lot of the times in pop culture, when we think of insane asylum, we think of horror movies, right? That's the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear the word insane asylum, right? Our horror movies, our TV shows, our video games, and bad, creepy stuff is always happening in them. And that kind of image takes root in this time period, where a lot of really grotesque things were happening in the treatment of the mentally ill. So you can see here during the 16th and 17th centuries, which would be the 15 and 1600s, people whose only crime may have been that they suffered from some type of psychological disorder, or maybe even a physical disorder or a neurological disorder. They were associated with evil, with being cursed, and this idea they needed to be put somewhere, taken away from society. Okay, the mentally ill were housed in these huge mental asylums called insane asylums or institutions. This is a very famous picture of one, St. Mary of Bethlehem, London Hospital, where patients were all often chained and slept on straw beds. Even at the old prison here in Winnipeg, the one that's right downtown, Vaughan Street Prison, they had a whole spot in the basement where they kept criminally insane prisoners. And even here in Winnipeg, they were chained to the floors, right? So the treatment of the mentally ill in the criminal system was brutal and horrible as well, and they were treated like criminals, even if all they suffered from was mental illness and maybe not fitting into the norms of a society in a given time period. Okay, you see here visitors on the weekends could pay a penny to come and watch the mentally ill, or who they used to call the mentally insane, kind of like a freak show, right? So outsiders would come into these inhumane places and watch, right? The conditions were disorganized, unsanitary, inhumane. The word bedlam comes from this contraction to describe those kind of conditions that are just chaotic and unsanitary and disorganized. It's bedlam, right? And it comes from this, right? From this idea of what these insane asylums, or these asylums that were supposed to be treating the mentally ill, were actually like in this time period. Okay, so there's all kinds of drawings. Obviously there wasn't photography at this time, of how these people were kept. Okay, and there's all kinds of things going on in this picture, right? You notice people being chained to the walls. This man's not in a shirt, right? You see, people in anguish in the background. You see other people that clearly are from the outside world coming in to watch. It just looks like total chaos, okay? You can see in the 18th century, which is the 1700s, many mentally ill people in Paris were chained to the walls, and the intendants, or keepers, as they were called, rarely showed compassion. They administered punishment, physical punishment, psychological punishment, whenever they felt like it was necessary. Eventually, physicians began to become more compassionate towards inmates. One such doctor, who was Dr. Pinel, removed patients' chains and directed his staff to treat them kindly, and he stopped the use of old practices like bloodletting, which was in your handout before, which was this idea that they thought that by draining people's blood they could cure physical sickness. So they would either cut certain points at their body and let the person bleed a bit, or they'd attach like leeches to them. Bloodletting was a common treatment for hundreds of years. It obviously doesn't work. It's not a real treatment. But they really thought it was linked to kind of letting out that bad blood that would cure physical and sometimes mental illnesses. So this doctor started arguing for something that he called, you can see on your sheet here, moral therapy or moral management, which stated that humane and relaxed environments could produce positive changes in individuals, and that toxic and inhumane environments would make people more sick. And we know this is true today. Okay, so this idea started to catch on in like the 17 and 1800s, that maybe we need to treat the mentally ill in humane ways to actually help them get better. Benjamin Rush introduced moral therapy, this whole concept, to the United States, where hospitals began to create separate units for the mentally ill. And this is a long time ago, but now this would be like a psych ward. So we know that our hospitals now do have wards for people who are suffering psychological breakdown or disturbances and need some kind of help sometimes even medical help. And so this was starting, in the 1800s, and now we would have, what we would call a psych ward attached to general hospitals, and showing this connection between your physical health and your mental health. Okay? You can see here, Benjamin Rush, he expected his staff at his clinics or hospitals to be friends with the patients, but he still used techniques that today would be considered, inhumane. He created this, which is his tranquilizer chair. So basically, a person who was, having a breakdown or needed to be calmed would be strapped into this chair. You can see strapped in, and then they put this kind of device over the person's head, and it would show them calming images. We know now that being strapped into a chair isn't very calming for most people. Usually restraints aren't used anymore unless you're physically going to harm yourself or someone else. But his patients would sit in this kind of chair for long periods of time, and it probably wasn't helping them at all. In the mid-19th century, there became a greater obligation to provide care for the mentally ill. As states came to assume more responsibilities for the custodial care of the mentally ill, economics dictated they build larger institutions that could handle lots of patients. And so you get the rise of what's known as mental institutions. So this was a long time ago in the past. So we saw, the asylums of the 14 and 15 and 1600s. It moves into this kind of treatment into the 17 and 1800s. And then at the turn of the century in the 1900s, you see the rise of mental institutions. And so there's a lot of controversy about mental institutions. We know in the 50s and 60s, the attitude was still that mentally ill people needed to be taken out of their communities, that they needed to be put somewhere. A lot of the times their families would drop them at these places, thinking that it was better for them. We know these places didn't have a lot of money, so they were understaffed and there was a lot of people, and they relied heavily on restraining devices to keep control of patients, such as this one here, treatments that nowadays we would consider inhumane. Okay? Institutions became more like warehouses to hold patients and not really facilities that were treating them or helping to rehabilitate them. They're just being held there. And people with a lot of mental illnesses that today would be out in the community and be, controlled through medication or through therapy. Even mild things like depression and some anxiety, people would be going and putting them into institutions. So a really different shift in attitude towards how we look at mental illness today. So there's lots of images. These are patients in an institution all wearing straitjackets. In the early 20th century, so the 1900s, there became more research that there's biological causes of mental illness, that rehabilitation and treatment and therapy needed to also take place. What you start seeing in a lot of these institutions is a lot of experimental therapy. You have a vulnerable group of people that no one's really checking in on. You have doctors who are starting to experiment with drugs and with therapies, and two of the well-known ones are electric shock therapy, which was used widely in the UK and United States and Canada to treat a variety of mental illnesses. There's not a lot of evidence that using this shock therapy helped a lot of these people. There are forms of shock therapy today. They're not called shock therapy anymore. It's electric therapy. It's very controlled. We know a lot about the brain. We know what parts of the brain do. So it's very different what's used today. In this time period, they would just shock the whole brain, induce a seizure, hoping it would kind of reset the person's mind, which we know isn't great. We know was false science, and we also know caused some damage. They also did lobotomies, which was a blind surgery. Keep in mind, they hadn't really mapped the brain yet, where they would go in and they would literally drill a hole in people's brains and scrape out parts of their brains. And they thought that this would also help behavior, particularly like violent urges or extreme mental illnesses. And lots of people were damaged in these surgeries and had all kinds of side effects for surgeries that were phased out eventually because they weren't legit. Which is interesting. So what you are going to be doing the next two classes, you're actually going to start watching, again, these are just restraining devices, a documentary, and it's called Mental, And I saw it in university. It's called The History of the Madhouse, and it looks at these mental institutions that were going on from like the 50s, 60s, 70s, and started to be phased out in the 80s, the 1980s. And it follows Hyroids, which is one of the biggest mental institutions in the UK. But similar stuff was happening in the United States and in Canada. It's a very interesting documentary that shows what was happening in these institutions. So for tomorrow's class, I'm going to give you the link, and you just have to watch it. And there's also an assignment attached with a reflection about things that stood out to you and some guided questions for discussion. So this is what you're going to be doing tomorrow and the day after. I will give you the video link and the assignment. The video it will take one class, so you'll have 2 classes to do this. You can watch and pause and answer the questions, or you can watch and then do the questions the second day. I do want to give you a heads up. Some of the footage is hard to watch. So you know what you can handle. You can skip over parts. They are going to show real footage of shock therapy, which some people might find hard to watch. They are going to show a brain surgery, so you will see an opened head with a brain. So if you're squeamish with blood or with seeing a surgery like that, you can either skip over that part or just kind of look away for it. I just want to give you a heads up. Those are the worst things to see is the shock therapy on a patient and lobotomy. But those are just 2 parts of it. And then the rest is a really good and interesting documentary about the rise of these institutions. The second half of the documentary talks about the 1980s and 1990s and brings us more to current day. In the 80s, institutions started to close, and they started to phase it out. And it talks about the shutting down of these institutions, which in theory seems like a really good idea, because we know there was a lot of abuse, we know there was a lot of fake science being used, we know these people were being harmed and not really rehabilitated, treated like prisoners. But the problem with deinstitutionalization, which is the last part on your handout there, is that as all these institutions shut down, there wasn't really anything in place in a lot of communities to accept all these people that traditionally would have been housed in mental institutions. So a lot of them were just sent into the community after being institutionalized for many, many years, and they weren't able to function properly. So it talks about the link between the shutting down of mental institutions and the rise of homelessness. It talks about public's attitudes for having people with undiagnosed psychiatric illness walking on the streets. It talks about a crime where a man was deinstitutionalized and then he kills another man on the subway in London. And they talked about whether that was the result of letting people with mental illnesses into society again. So there's a lot of debate, which was worse, institutions or non-institutions, right? Obviously shutting these places was important, but releasing people into a community where there's not a lot of mental health resources available at this time, it made it hard for these people. So there was definitely cons to the deinstitutionalization too. And that's what we'll be talking about in our next group chat next week. So the second half of the film talks about deinstitutionalization. We're going to link it to the case of Vince Lee, which is a local case here in Manitoba. I don't know if you remember years back, he was the man with schizophrenia who murdered the other man on the Greyhound bus. And he has been in a mental institution since then, but recently has been released back into the public. There's a lot of debate locally in our province whether this was correct or not. And that's something you're going to read an article on Vince Lee, and you're going to have to form an opinion about, you know, what happens when people are deinstitutionalized and in the public, and whose responsibility is it to take care of these people. So it's not an easy topic, and there's no right answer. There's problems with institutions, there's problems with no institutions. This documentary does a really good job at showing both sides. So the last part of your paper talks about deinstitutionalization, which is just the term for the shutting down of all of these institutions throughout Canada, the States, and the UK, and the process of discharging these people back into the community and a movement towards what's known as community care for mental health. We still obviously have institutions to care for the mentally ill or for people who are struggling. It's just a different protocol to have someone committed to it now, and obviously they're not run the way they were in this time period. But way more people would not be institutionalized today, whereas back in this time period it was more common for people to be institutionalized than to receive community care. So you can see, despite the availability of new treatments, many seriously disturbed individuals continued to be housed in overcrowded and understaffed mental hospitals. Beginning in the 1950s, populations of these mental hospitals began to decline. There's a lot of different reasons, right? One was the use of drugs as a form of treatment. So a lot of people could take drugs to control the symptoms of their disorders, and they weren't needing to be in the institutions any longer. Okay, they could go and live in the community, be productive members of society, and control their symptoms with psychological drugs, right? So as these drugs became forms of treatment, people's lives changed because of it. Okay, there was also a really strong public belief that these institutions needed to be shut down, and that community care was better and more effective than hospitalization for people with mental illnesses. Today there's a community mental health movement in which greater funding is given for the establishment of community mental health care centers instead of institutions, where patients can go and get treated and then leave, and they're not being housed or having to stay in these institutions. In addition, laws started being passed in the 1960s, which made it much more difficult to commit someone to a mental institution. You had to go through all these legal procedures. You had to basically prove that they were a danger to themselves or to others, and that they would benefit from being in an institution, that they needed that 24-hour care. Whereas back in the 50s and 60s, like I said, a lot of people just wanted the mentally ill out of the communities. The attitude was, you need to put them somewhere, you need to isolate them, they need to be out, right? Shunned, hidden, right? And a lot of people, unfortunately, would drop their relatives there because of embarrassment or because of stigma, which is changing. Our attitudes are changing now, obviously. Moreover, during the 1960s, state and federal courts restricted the grounds of committing people. All these factors led to this policy of deinstitutionalization, which the definition's there. It's the discharging of large numbers of patients from mental hospitals. And you'll see this process in the last half of the documentary. They'll talk about the shutting of these great mental institutions. Okay, we know, again, it was a good thing because of the abuse and how ineffective a lot of these institutions were. But the last part of this paper talks about some of the problems, right? It says the policy of deinstitutionalization has added to the number of people who are homeless. Studies are showing us that rates of schizophrenia, addiction, whether that's alcohol or drugs, are higher among the homeless than in the general population. So a lot of people who are homeless are suffering mental illness. In the past, they would have been cared for in mental institutions, and now they're kind of on the streets and at the hand of charity. So that's a con for shutting down these institutions. Maybe they would have been better cared for in a facility that provided them food and routine. It's a tough debate. Okay, it is estimated, these are American statistics, but it's estimated that approximately 200,000 individuals with schizophrenia or manic depressive disorder are homeless. So roughly about 1/3 of the homeless population in the United States are people that suffer mental illness that at one time would have been housed in institutions. Okay, also at any given rate, they suggest that there are more people with untreated severe psychiatric illness living on the American streets than are actually receiving treatment, which is another argument. At least in the institutions, they were receiving treatment. If you just release them into the community and there's no care and they can't function and they're on the streets, they're not receiving any treatment. So pros and cons, it's a super hard issue. Ultimately, we need more mental health funding and more attention given to mental illness, obviously, even today. But this is kind of the history of how we went from insane asylums and torturing the mentally ill and thinking they were evil to like these institutions where, you know, at the time they thought they were helping people, but we're still products of stigma and fear and, you know, misunderstanding about how the brain works and what mental illness is. to where we are today, where we've seen this process of deinstitutionalization, and we've seen the pros and cons of it, and we've moved to community care, and we're moving to education about mental illness and ending the stigma, and people feeling safe and able to express their mental illnesses and feel supported and cared for and not rejected from our communities. So it's a really good overview. So like I said, today all you're doing is going through and highlighting important things from this handout that I gave you. I just wanted to introduce the topic. I'm also going to attach the first unit review to our lesson. So after you've read through this was just set up for tomorrow. You can spend the rest of the period starting to organize your unit reviews for our first unit test, which we'll talk about later in the week. Tomorrow you will get the link for the documentary and the assignment that goes with it, and that's what you'll be working on the next 2 classes. So you can watch the documentary and do the assignment. 2 classes, 1 to watch, 1 to do the assignment. And then we'll probably have a group chat where we can talk about what we saw in this documentary. We can talk about your views on the treatment of the mentally ill throughout history, and we can connect it to our current case of Vince Lee, which was local in our province and ties really well into this debate or this discussion about how we approach and treat mental illness in our society. So I hope that made sense, and I will send this to you tomorrow. Thanks.